Okay, Boker Tov, Shabbat Tov. Welcome back, everybody, to the new slot of Tzurba and Rabbi on a Monday morning. Not to be confused with Sunday morning, 10 a.m. See how it goes. What's that?
Not to be confused with no connection.
Okay, no connection. We are continuing now. We're up to volume 20 of the Tzurba and Rabbi series of Hilchot Shabbat. This is the fifth volume of Hilchot Shabbat. We started all the way back at volume 16, so we've gone through 16. Yeah, it's 5 volumes. There's another 2 that have been 22 has been printed. We will at some point over the coming weeks be switching into a Yamim Noraim mode. So we'll be talking about Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, etc. Maybe next week, maybe the week after. I'm not sure yet. But for now, let's begin and let's jump right back into the halachot of Shabbat. First year we have, and again, we don't have the books here yet, but they will arrive, not today, but they will arrive shortly. Halachot of personal care on Shabbat. The last thing I think we spoke about was home maintenance and halachot relating to the outside and watering plants, etc., which you should not do on Shabbat. We spoke about the different parameters of how and why. Today we'll talk about washing ourselves on Shabbat, which is a very, very interesting question as well. Very interesting historical discussion how this transpired. We've seen the Gemara. Because there's quite a lot you can learn about rabbinic decrees and when they are effective and when they're not effective. The Gemara has a fascinating story to tell us about that. So let's begin. Again, now we're less going through the different melachot one by one, but rather going through according to topic. It's just the way it is. So the topic here is washing. Again, as I mentioned before, this will be Torah Sheba'al Peh. I have the sources in front of me. I will do my best to read them and translate them slowly enough so that people can follow. So we have, through in Gemara Masechet Shabbat, there are a number of different discussions regarding washing oneself on Shabbat, and there's a related topic, which is Yom Tov, which we'll touch on as well, which has a number of important nafkaminot relating to. So first of all, we have a Tosefta. The Gemara Shabbat says, Tanya, Lo yishtatef adam kol gufo, ben b'chamin or ben betzonen divrei Rabbi Meir. The first opinion of Rabbi Meir says one cannot wash one's entire body on Shabbat, whether it's with hot water or with cold water. Rabbi Shimon Matir, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, b'chamin asur, b'tzonen mutar. So we have a three-way machloket amongst the Tanaim. Rabbi Meir says you cannot wash at all. Rabbi Shimon says you can wash, and Rabbi Yehuda says you can't wash with hot water, but you can wash with cold water. We'll see. This is the stage of the Tanaim. We'll see how this develops as we get into the Rishonim and the Achronim as well. But then, says the Gemara, something else, makes another distinction. The first thing we see, there are essentially 3 or 4 different distinctions we have to make. One is regarding the temperature of the water, and we'll see why that's significant. It's the easiest one to understand. Second of all, we'll talk a bit later on about what do we mean when we say washing. There's going to be a difference between taking a bath or taking a shower, for example. There's going to be a difference between essentially washing one's entire body versus washing one's hands, face, etc. And here the Gemara says further, it says, machloket b'karka, aval b'kli, divrei hakol mutar. So when you have water that's collected in the ground, again going back to the days of the Gemara before modern plumbing systems, but that is the machloket. But if the water is in a kli, meaning you have a big bathtub, essentially, where all the water is collected, that would be forbidden according to everybody. We paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. In other words, that we distinguish between hot and cold water. So first of all, why is it that water that is collected into a vessel, to a kli, into a big tub, would be forbidden? So Rashi tells us as follows. He says, you have b'kli, he says, Haro'eh omer hayom huchmu. All of this is going to be related to, we'll see there are other minor issues as well, but the major issue that we have, what's the number one melacha, I should say. What's the number one difficulty that we have regarding washing oneself in water on Shabbat? Sorry? Heating the water, right? Exactly. We've discussed in the past, we've discussed that of Tud Shemesh, etc. But when we, by heating water, one is actually cooking, and therefore the restriction. Now, I could ask the question, what melacha am I transgressing? Which melacha of the Torah am I transgressing if I was to wash in hot water on Shabbat? Answer: none. There is no melacha of washing. This is important. There's no melacha of washing. What's that? Trick question. Right? There's no melacha of washing. There is a melacha of cooking. Cooking is, and again, as we've discussed in the past, one would not transgress the melacha of cooking only if one intends to eat the food. So boiling water is essentially considered cooking. That is the melacha of bishul. So therefore, we're going to find a restriction on washing with hot water if I have boiled the water, if I've cooked, in order to prevent us from cooking the water. But washing itself is not the melacha. The melacha is heating the water. And there are no books today. So Rashi says over here, he says, if you see somebody who has a big jug, a big tub of water, which they're using to wash themselves, right, big tub of hot water, you'll see them, and what will you think? Where do they have hot water? They must have heated the water, right? In other words, you're worried that people are going to see that if you're washing from this big container, so if all the water's been collected into a vessel, so it must be that you went and you heated up the vessel today and heated up the water. We're worried about people heating up water. So let's just go back for a moment.
It's not even be really an issue today because, see that. Now, then you would have thought, how can you possibly have hot water unless it's cooked it now? And now you're pointing at your default would be like, obviously you have.
Right. So it may be and it may not be. Again, you're pointing out an idea that when we get to halachot, which are marit ayin or chashad or these types of things, where we don't do X because we're worried that people may think that it appears. So at what point does that change? So so there are cases where something that has become accepted and has become the normal way of doing things, and therefore we're no longer concerned for it. So a great example is, there are all these chuvot written 30, 40 years ago about the hotels, right? Are the hotels allowed to serve soya milk, tea and coffee with milk at the end of a meat meal? And the poskim say you have to have the box on the table so that everybody knows, because otherwise they'll come to suspect that you're serving a non-kosher meat. And nowadays, right? Right. They had to put up signs. Nowadays, okay, everybody knows. Nowadays, if you have milk that's actually milk, that's the exception, right? Maybe then you need to put the sign. But I'm kidding. But the stickers on the yeah. But, nowadays you have, you want to go, you have 35 different types. You have almond milk like this and soy milk like that, and with lactose, whatever. You have all these different types. So that's an example whereby there's no married iron anymore. We're not concerned. Other cases not so clear cut. For example, I'll give another example that's closer to home. We're talking about Hilchot Shabbat. So when we started off a long time ago, you may remember, hopefully you remember, we learned Hilchot Bishul, right? We learned about cooking. And one of the issues that we have, many cases, we talk about Bishul D'Rabbanan, right? We talk about what's called Michzik and Mashal, something which looks like cooking. Okay, so here's a classic example. You have a hot plate, right? A plata, Shal Shabbat. Right, to place food, we discussed this at length. I'm not getting into all the details now. If you're interested, I refer you back to the YouTube. Can I place food, hot, dry food, directly onto the hot plate on Shabbat morning? So there are poskim who say, sure, why not? Everybody knows that you don't use a hot plate to cook, as Rav Ovadia, right? Everybody knows you don't use a hot plate to cook. You use it to heat up food. You're allowed to heat up food, and therefore it's fine. Other poskim say, no, we said mitzvikim vashel. You have to include, as the Gemara says, you have to include some sort of a heker, some sort of a recognizable sign, put it on top of a pot, have it just whatever, so that it doesn't look like cooking. All right. So at what point does that change? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. We need to evaluate on a case-by-case basis. Okay, but here we get into the crux of the matter. So the Gemara on the next daf, on daf Mem Amud Aleph, and it's very, very easy to remember this because we're about to talk about Gezerat HaMerchatzaot, the bathhouse decree. So Merchatzaot starts with the letter Mem, and that's why they put it in the Gemara on daf Mem. It's not really why they put it in the Gemara on daf Mem, but that's the very easy way to remember it, right? You can go out and impress all your friends. Gezerat Merchatzaot is on the Gemara Shabbat daf Mem, right? How did you know that? So it's very, very, very easy. That's the siman. By the way, what? By the way, the Gemara is full of this. The Gemara is full of simanim. Oftentimes, we often skip it. It's in the brackets. But you'll be learning, and the Gemara will say siman, and it will have a few random cryptic words. And that is to help you remember what's coming next. Okay, so that's your siman. Merchatzaot is daf mem. Even though it's not in front of you, you'll all remember where it is. And this is a fascinating Gemara. The Gemara says as follows. Okay, again, back in those days, most common was not that people had baths or showers inside their own homes. You went to a public bathhouse. That's what we're talking about. So the Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Mishum bar Kapara. Says the Gemara, Batchila hayu rochtzin b'chamin shehukmu me'erev Shabbat. So originally, says the Gemara, they would wash on Shabbat in hot water. And as we've said, obviously you can't heat water on Shabbat. That is a melacha, the oraita of Bishul. But water that was heated from before Shabbat, so there's no problem washing it. התחילו הבלנים לכם בשבת ואומרים מערב שבת הוחמו. Right, so this is where we have these unscrupulous bathhouse attendants. And what they would do, you have to remember, there was competition, right? Money is money, right? So there was competition and going on. There was Cohen's bathhouse, which has got the hottest water on Shabbat, and Goldberg's bathhouse has got the hottest water on Shabbat, right? So they would go and they would, so they would say, they would heat in order to keep the water hot, they would come to heat it on Shabbat. And they would say, oh, we heated it yesterday, we've got a fancy system, whatever. Right, so בתחילה יורחתם בחמין שוכמים בערב שבת, התחילה בנים לכם בשבת, they would heat up the water on Shabbat itself, okay? ואומרים, מערב שבת הוחמו, and they would say it was heated up before Shabbat. So now how are we going to stop this? So if people are allowed to go and wash in water that was heated before Shabbat, so then they'll just carry on saying, we heated it up before Shabbat. So therefore, came Chachamim and said, asur et hachamin, v'hitiru et hazayah. This does not mean that they forbade us from eating cholent. It means chamin here is hot water, right? Asur et hachamin, they said you can now you cannot go and wash in hot water. Why? Even if it was heated before Shabbat. Because those people who were heating it up on Shabbat and saying it was before Shabbat, therefore they said even water before Shabbat you cannot, right? But hitiru et hazayah. So there were different rooms and different things in this bathhouse. They said you can't go and wash in the hot water, but you can go into the steam room, you can go into the sauna, right? That's fine. And what happened? So people would go in and they say, oh, we're going in for the sauna, and they'd go in and they'd go into the next room and they'd wash. So then, they said, okay, well, the sauna you can't do either. What can you do? Hitiru chamei Tveria. So chamei Tveria does not mean only in Tveria, but if you have hot springs underground called chamei Tveria, because the most famous is in Tveria, and therefore you don't actually have to heat the water. The water is hot anyway. So Chachamim said, okay. So the first stage was you can wash even in water that was heated, even in hot water that was heated before Shabbat. Then they said you can't wash in hot water that was heated before Shabbat because of these people who are heating on Shabbat, but you can go into the steam. And then they said you can't go into the steam either. But chamei Tveria, you can still go and wash. So you could still go and wash in hot water, but that wasn't heated at all. That's been heated naturally. Now, guess what happens next? ועדיין יורצים בחמי האור, ואומרים בחמי טבריה לחצנו. So people would carry on and they would still bath and they would say, what are you doing? And they'd say, oh, it's chamei Tveria. It's not actually chamei Tveria, it's water that was heated up by fire. So then, as you say, Chachamim said, okay, asur le'en chamei Tveria, v'tilu le'en tatzonen. They said, fine, you cannot wash in any hot water at all, even the chamei Tveria. You can still wash in cold. See what happens a few centuries later about the cold water. We'll get there. But they said you cannot wash at all. And now, here's where it gets really, really interesting. Says the Gemara, Ra'u she'ena davar omed lahem. At this point, people said, no, this is too much. You rabbis, we're not... the truth, we see this throughout the Gemara. We have principles, we have ideas of, right, ein gzera, ein gozun gzera, she'ena tzibur yachol amod bo. For whatever reason, this was the gzera that the tzibur couldn't... Nowadays, in many places, it's the opposite. Nowadays, you say it's mutar. It's like, what do you mean it's mutar? The famous story, famous joke. Rabbi, you and your Shulchan Aruch are going to trafe off my kitchen, right? But that's so asur le'en chamei Tveria v'tilu le'en tatzonen or she'en hadavar omed. Now, in other words, the Chachamim saw that it was too stringent, meaning nobody was listening. So they had to go back. They had to repeal some of the things. So hitiru lahen chamei Tveria v'zaya bimkoma omeret. In other words, at this point, they said, okay, chamei Tveria, in the naturally heated water from the underground springs, that's fine. You can wash in that on Shabbat. The ze'ah, going back to the steaming, that they said was still forbidden.
Well, another they didn't say they were not no shrimp like Saman because people say there was Saman really.
Yeah. That was so essentially we'll see the Shulchan Aruch in just a moment, but essentially these are the 5 stages. If you had the books in front of you, which again I apologize you don't today, but next time B'ezrat Hashem, but goes through the stages of this Gzeirah. Again, just a quick recap. We said originally there is no malacha from the Torah against washing on Shabbat. There's a malacha against heating up water. So therefore, people would go, you could wash in water that was heated before Shabbat. You could wash in hot water. But people were heating up water on Shabbat. So they said, okay, you can't wash in hot water, even if it was heated before Shabbat. So then people were going into the steam, into the sauna, and then they were going to wash as well. So they said, you can't go into the sauna. Okay. Then they were going and they were washing in the Chamei Tveria, meaning the water of the hot springs. And they said, you can't do that either. And at this point, there was a rebellion. People said, no, we're just going to go and wash. You rabbis are being too stringent. We're going to do whatever we want. So I said, okay. You can wash in the Chamei Tveria, but you cannot wash in hot water. Okay, so that is where we stand. One cannot wash in hot water on Shabbat. One more Gemara, and then we'll bring it down to the Shulchan Aruch and to the practical halacha. I mentioned this distinction before, but the Gemara on the same daf says as follows. He says, Itma meaning we have a discussion amongst the Amoraim. Chamin she'ochmu me'elev Shabbat. Okay, clearly this is before, or not clear, whether this is before or after the Gzerah. But we have water which was heated before Shabbat. Here we have a machloket. Rav Amar lemachar rochetz ben kol gufo evar evar. V'shmuel Amar lo etir lechotz ela panav yadav raglav. In other words, if you have warm water which was heated before Shabbat, Rav says, I could use that water, not at the same time, but to wash my entire body, one limit at a time. And Shmuel says, no, you can't wash the whole body, only face, hands, and feet. Okay. So let us see, those are the 3 main discussions in the Gemara, all more or less on the same daf. Let's see what the Shulchan Aruch says now. The Shulchan Aruch in Siman Shin Kaf Vav, which is the Siman that deals with washing on Shabbat. Again, at this point, we're just dealing with hot water. We'll get to cold water soon. But seemingly, after all the discussions that we've had, cold water would not be a problem at this point. But let's see about hot water. So says the Shulchan Aruch like this. He says, Asor lechotz kol gufo, afilu kol evar ve'evar levad. One may not wash one's entire body, even one limit at a time. Afilu b'mayim she'ochmu me'elev Shabbat, even with water that was heated before Shabbat. Right? בין אם הם בכלי, בין אם הם בקרקע. ואפילו לשפוך המים על גופו להשתתף, אסור, אבל מותר לחוץ בין פניו ידיו רגליו. In other words, says the Shulchan Aruch, hot water washing on Shabbat absolutely forbidden. The only thing you could do is you could wash your hands and your face, right, one at a time. Says the Rama, or shal evalim kol she'eno lochetz kol gufo. Rama says, so long as you're not washing the entire body. Then the Shulchan Aruch continues. He says, Ane mele b'chamei ha'ul. All of this, we're talking about water that was heated by fire. Aval b'chamei tveria, mutar lechot afilu kol gufo yachad. As we saw, the end of the Gemara. Chamei tveria, water from these hot springs, could wash your whole body. V'ein tzarich lomar b'tzonanin. Says the Shulchan Aruch, and of course, cold water would be permitted. Okay, that essentially is the Shulchan Aruch. Now, before we get to
watch a little bit or what, it's not the same problem. Right? If we're concerned about, we're concerned with the water, if we're worried that the water is being warmed up now, then how much should it be?
Okay, so it all goes back to the Gzerah, meaning the decree that they made. The question is how far do we go? How far are we to what point? If you say you're only going to use the water if you say you're going to use water to wash your whole body, so we're still concerned that people would go and would heat the water, would claim that it was done before. If it's only for your face, so okay, that seems to be less of a. So again, the whole point is we're concerned that people are going to come and heat water on Shabbat. So originally we said the Chachamim, when they extended the Gzeirah, they said even the Chamei Tveria you can't use, but they thought that was too difficult for people, so they stopped listening. So they said, okay, any water that was heated by man, that was heated in fire, that cannot be used. The Chamei Tveria is a separate category. We leave that to itself. Okay, so now there is a question here, which is, if I have water that was heated on Shabbat, that I did not heat on Shabbat, that was heated by itself, we saw Chamei Teveri. Chamei Teveri as a separate category. It was never heat, it was always hot. But let's say, for example, I have a Dud Shemesh. I'm not going to get into. We spoke once upon a time about Dud Shemesh. Very, very, very complicated discussion. Just to refresh our memories, there are different ways that I can heat water, different sources of heat. Right? When we spoke about bishul, we spoke about cooking. We saw that something which is heated up by the sun, right, versus something which is heated up by fire is different category. Something which is heated up by the sun, that's not a problem. It's not considered cooking on Shabbat. Whereas heating up by fire is. Heating up by derivatives is also going to be problematic. Rabbanan said that heat, which is a derivative from the heat of the sun, I'm worried that you're going to get confused and think there was heat from the derivative of fire, and therefore you're going to come to use the fire. Therefore, that's not allowed. But if it's from the sun itself, that's okay. So when it comes to a Dud Shemesh, there's a whole big discussion in the poskim where you have the receptors, right? The way that the water is heated up. Do we consider it that it's heated directly by the sun, or do we consider that it's that it's heated by derivatives of the sun? There are other questions as well, very, very complicated. Not getting into it now. Bottom line is, there are those, we discussed it once, there are those poskim who say that you can use water that's been heated up by Dud Shemesh. There are those poskim who say you can't. Generally speaking, in cases of great need for babies, etc., will be more lenient. But the question is, so assuming that we can use the water from the Dud Shemesh, for example, would you be allowed to now use that water to wash on Shabbat? So we have here, the way it's presented here in this book is as a machloket. I'm not 100% sure that it actually is a machloket, but the Mishnah Berurah writes as follows. He says, "Anu chamin she'achmu me'erev Shabbat, aval." He's talking there about where we talking about the Shulchan Aruch over here. He says, "Aval b'chamin she'achmu b'Shabbat asur afilu yadav levad." Says the Mishnah Berurah, that which the Shulchan Aruch said that I could wash certain parts of my body, a small part of my body, with water that was with hot water. That means water that was heated before Shabbat, but water that was heated on Shabbat itself, even to wash my hands, I cannot use. Now the Shmirat Shabbat Kilchata, which is a contemporary work, writes as follows. He says, "Ma'im shechmu b'Shabbat al yedei chom ha'esh, mibli shenasta b'hem b'Shabbat kol pu'ulat hachama." In other words, water that was heated on Shabbat, I did not transgress the melacha of bishul to cook this water on Shabbat, but it was done by itself. How? Let's say I had a pot of water that was left on the fire before Shabbat. So on Shabbat, nobody did any melacha to heat it up. Or for example, in a Dud Shemesh and the like, it says, "Ko ele dinam kimva la'el, dahainu, shemutar le'chotz b'hem chelek min haguf, aval lo et kol haguf kulo, afilu lo eva levado." In other words, he says that water, even though it became warm on Shabbat, I'm allowed to use it to wash my hands or to wash a part of my body, not the entire body. That is the Shmat Shabbat Kehilchata. So bottom line, until now, what have we seen? We've seen that hot water, I may not heat water on Shabbat. I may not use water that was heated, certainly if water was heated on Shabbat in a forbidden way, I certainly can't benefit from that. That's Maaseh Shabbat. That's a different discussion. But water that was heated, even water that was heated before Shabbat, I cannot wash myself. I cannot wash my entire body. Says the Shulchan Aruch, a small portion of small portion of one's body, one's hand or one's face alone, if it's water that was heated before Shabbat, or says the Shmat Shabbat Kilchata, even if it was heated on Shabbat in a permitted way, then I'm allowed to use that to wash that part of the body. Okay. What about Yom Tov? Until now we've been speaking about Shabbat. We still have to get to the cold water. We'll get there, I haven't forgotten. But what about Yom Tov? Now, why would you think that Yom Tov would be different? The reason you would think Yom Tov would be different is because the Malacha of Bishul, which is a prohibition on Shabbat, is permitted on Yom Tov. It's for Ochel Nefesh. So I would think that I'm allowed to, if the whole reason that I cannot wash is because it's coming to prevent me from heating up the water. So on Yom Tov, when I'm allowed to heat up water in the first place, then I would think that everything should be okay. It's not so straightforward, however. It's never that straightforward. Okay, so says the Rif. We have the Rif here in Mesechet Beitzah, who is a little bit more lenient, he writes the following. He says, "Le'inyan rechitza b'Yom Tov b'chamin shechmu me'erev Yom Tov." Now he quotes here the Gaon. He quotes one of the Gaonim. He does not say who it was, but one of the Gaonim was the Rosh Shiva in Bavel, came right before the Rishonim. He writes something very interesting. He says, "B'Yom Tov shari l'chotz." This Gaon writes that b'Yom Tov shari l'chotz kol gufo b'chamin shechmu me'erev Yom Tov. Again, he's still talking about water that was heated before Yom Tov. But he says you could, in other words, the Gzerat Mechatzaot, when Chazal made a Gzerat, many times, Chazal made a Gzerat that applies on Shabbat, there's no reason to distinguish. That would make a law plug, meaning they would say would apply on Shabbat, would apply on Yom Tov as well. So he says this would not apply on Yom Tov. The lav davar shechayavin alav mishum shvut, velo mishum mushut, velo mishum mitzvai, ela gzerai. V'chi gazru b'Shabbat aval b'Yom Tov lo. So very interesting. This whole Gzerat HaMerchatzaot, what we've been talking about, this whole source of this prohibition of washing on Shabbat with water that was heated before Shabbat because of what they would do in the bathhouses, in the Merchatzaot, which appears in the Gemara Masechet Shabbat, Taf? Very good. Mem, right, Merchatzaot, excellent. So, that Gzeirah, see how it's this going? He says this is not a regular Gzeirah. Okay? Normally we have an Isud Rabbanan of Shabbat is called a Shvut. Shvut means that it's a categorical rabbinic prohibition. Or he says it's not a shvut, it's not a shut, not a mitzvah. It's strange language, but he says it's a gzeira, meaning it's some sort of lower level gzeira, whatever that means. And this gzeira would apply to Shabbat, but did not apply to Yom Tov. Okay, the rationale, the logic behind that makes a lot of sense. If you're saying that the logic is we're worried that people are going to come to heat the water, so in Yom Tov, even if you come to heat the water, you're allowed to heat the water in the first place. Okay. It's a little bit more complicated than that.
Be sure for like also never. I mean, water qualifies. What if you're not planning on consuming it at any point?
You're talking about Yom Tov.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what we call. So this is why I was about to say it gets a little bit more complicated. We have a Mishnah in Masechet Beitzah that the Mishnah says essentially is Machloket Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, but according to Beit Hillel, we say one is not allowed to heat water to wash one's entire body. One is allowed to heat water only to wash one's hand, face, and feet. Okay, only those. And then, so right into your question, we hold by a principle we call mitoch. When it comes to the halachot of Yom Tov, we say mitoch she'utra letzorach ochel nefesh, utra nami shelo letzorach ochel nefesh. Which means when it does not apply to every melacha, but most of the melachot, for example, applies to cooking and applies to many of the direct food-related. We say that since this melacha was permitted for the sake of ochel nefesh, for the sake of food preparation, it is therefore now been allowed for something which is not food preparation as well. So in the case of cooking, we'll say, just as you can heat up water to cook, so too you can heat up water to wash or whatever. But then the question becomes, if we say mitoch, and that principle, by the way, that principle is a machloket between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. We follow Beit Hillel, who say that we do apply such a principle. That's why we're allowed to carry on Yom Tov, but we're allowed to do many other things. In fact, this is why there's a very, very interesting nafkamina for this that comes up in Hilchot Sukkah. Okay, I know it's not our topic this moment, but bear with me because this is fantastic. There is the Gemara in Shabbat talks about making cheese. One is not allowed to make cheese on Shabbat. And again, if you've been to Tzfat recently and you've been to the Tzfat cheese factory, there are a number of them. Some of them are spelt right and the fake ones are spelt wrong. Tzfat cheese, Cheeze, or Z-E if you prefer. So in any event, but when the things are put together, it's what the Gemara calls megaben. Megaben means to make cheese. It's a derivative of, according to Tosfot, it's a derivative of the melacha of boneh, melacha of building. So if you're making cheese, that's ochel nefesh. Okay, without now getting into the way the whole sugya over there is learned, but there's certainly one way to learn the Gemara to say that these malachot apply on Shabbat, but would not apply on Yom Tov. And why? Because on Yom Tov you'd be allowed to make cheese. So Tosfot says something amazing. He says, you see from here that the malacha of boneh, the malacha of building, applies when it comes to making food. You're building the cheese. Therefore, you're allowed to make the cheese, you're allowed to build on Yom Tov. And since we say mitoch shutra letzorach nefesh, shutra namish lo letzorach nefesh, since we say you're allowed to perform the malacha for the sake of food, you're allowed to perform it also not for the sake of food. Therefore, says Tosfot, that building the malacha of boneh is a malacha which is there's no prohibition on Yom Tov. So why can't we build on Yom Tov? It says uvdin zochel. But now that in the theory, that's a fantastic principle. Where does it apply? Where is there an actual practical ramification of this? We find it in Chot Sukkah. And the case is as follows. And the Mishnah writes that if somebody has, let's say, your sukkah falls down on Yom Tov, not on Shabbat, but on Yom Tov, so you can't put it back up, certainly in Yisod Rabbanan, right? But would you be allowed to ask a non-Jew to put it back, to fix it? So normally we say, that again, and we'll get into the dinim of Amiral and Ochri, but generally we say the principle is I'm not allowed to ask a non-Jew to perform an Isur D'Oraita for me on Shabbat. But we have what's called a Shvut to Shvut. Shvut to Shvut b'makom mitzvah, which means it's a Shvut. It's an Isur D'Rabanan to ask a non-Jew to perform malacha. And if that which I'm asking him to perform is also an Isur D'Rabanan, that is Shvut to Shvut, it's two Isrei D'Rabanan, that's still forbidden. But if it's for the sake of a mitzvah, or if it's for the sake of Rabbim, it's allowed. And therefore, it's brought down, Shulchan Aruch, Mishnah Berurah, it's brought down that if your sukkah falls down on Yom Tov, you're allowed to ask a non-Jew to put it back up. And again, all this is based on the fact that it's an Isur D'Rabanan. Why is it an Isur D'Rabanan? Because it's boneh, which is a malacha, shemitoch shetra l'tzorach orcha nefesh. According to Tosfot, Rambam has a different explanation, but that's how it's looked at. So that's as I would say, mitoch. Okay. So anyway, how did we get onto that? We're talking about washing on Shabbat, or of course, Divrei Torah are all connected, and we go from one area to another. But so we were talking about mitoch in the context of heating up water, in the context of cooking. So the strange thing is, if you say mitoch, so you would have thought, okay, therefore I'm allowed to heat up water to wash on Yom Tov. But the Mishnah explicitly states that I cannot heat up water to wash one's entire body. And the question is why? So there are two main explanations in the Rishonim. There are those who say that actually the Gzerat HaMerchatzaot that we're talking about here on Shabbat, clearly it's not what the Rif says, the Gaon that the Rif quote said, learned differently. But the Rishonim will learn that because that Gzerah that applies on Shabbat would extend across to Yom Tov. But it extends differently. In other words, what's the Gzerah? The Gzerah is I'm going one step removed. I'm saying there's something which I can't do on Shabbat. In the case of Shabbat, I'm not allowed to heat up water on Shabbat. Therefore, Rabbanan added in the next step, which is you can't wash even in water that was heated before Shabbat. If I transplant that now to Yom Tov, and I say, okay, what is it that I'm not allowed to do on Yom Tov? On Yom Tov, I'm not allowed to heat up the water. No, I'm allowed to heat up the water. Right? So therefore, they would say like this: I'm not allowed to heat up the water in case I come to do it on Shabbat as well. In other words, going one stage before on Shabbat means that I can't wash on Shabbat. Going one stage before on Yom Tov means I can't heat up the water on Yom Tov to wash the whole body. So there are those who understand it like that. There are those who understand. But what that would mean, if I say if that's the reason that I cannot heat the water on Yom Tov, means that what if the water was now heated before Yom Tov? So if the water was heated before Yom Tov, that's further removed, and I could use that water and I could wash on Yom Tov. That's what the Rif says over here. That's actually how the Shulchan Aruch paskins. Okay, again, bringing it down into practical terms, talking about today's Shemesh and Chashma, etc. When I turn on the tap, is that considered water that was heated before Yom Tov or on Yom Tov? It's a little bit more complicated, but there are other factors as well. But just the basic. So that's the Shulchan Aruch, and he says, therefore, the baseline is that water that was heated before Yom Tov, I'm allowed to wash in on Yom Tov. Water that was heated on Yom Tov itself, I cannot. Tosfot has a different explanation for this, and the Ramah has a different explanation, which is comes to Yom Tov, something called Shaveh L'chol Nefesh. Okay, which means we say that you're allowed to perform a melacha of ochel nefesh on Yom Tov. There are certain conditions, however. By the way, the Rambam does not have this condition. You look through the Rambam, the entire Chot Yom Tov, you will not find this mentioned. It's in the Gemara. Could be the Rambam that paskins differently. But Tosfot and other Rishonim say it's not enough that it's for the sake of ochel nefesh, but it has to be what's called shaveh l'chol nefesh, meaning it's a normative need for most people. The Gemara has a case, it talks about mugmar, a type of incense or spices that they would burn, and it says, to get a pleasant smell, it says you're not allowed to do it on Yom Tov, because even though it's melech l'chol nefesh, because that is not shaveh l'chol nefesh. That's something which is a pampered people will do, but it's not something which ordinary people do. And therefore, says Tosfot, and again, writing in those days and at that time, washing one's entire body every day in hot water, that was not a normative need. That was not shaveh l'chol nefesh. And therefore, it's the fact that you can't heat up the water, according to Tosfot, and this is how the Ashkenazi, this is how the Ramah learns. It's not that this is part of the Gzeirah, but that this is already an Isur D'Oraita itself, because heating up the water to wash one's entire body is not a shaveh l'chol nefesh, not a normative need. And therefore, according to that approach, Shabbat, Yom Tov is much more similar to Shabbat. And therefore, even if the water was heated before Yom Tov, you would not be allowed to wash in it. Okay, that's the way that Ramah passes.
Water on cooking, like breathing.
You could cook water on chag for purposes of drinking. Correct. Yeah. Now, the question then becomes, so let me just summarize up to this point, because I know I've said a lot and it's getting confusing. Again, we started off, we said like this: Shabbat, according to everybody, water that was heated up, whenever it was heated up, however it was heated up, you have hot water on Shabbat, I'm not allowed to wash, certainly not one's entire body, I'm not allowed to wash on Shabbat in hot water. That's in order to prevent people from heating water on Shabbat. When it comes to Yom Tov, okay, we know that there is a limitation as well. Meaning that according to, I'm not allowed to heat water on Yom Tov to wash one's entire body. According to the Shulchan Aruch, if the water was heated before Shabbat, before Yom Tov, there's no issue to wash on Yom Tov. According to the Ramah, if the water was heated before Yom Tov, then it's still forbidden on Yom Tov. Why? Because of the principle of shaveh l'chol nefesh. And therefore the question now becomes, what was true in the days of Tosfot and what was true in the days of the Ramah is not necessarily true today. And I'll give you an example of this. A number of weeks ago we discussed, remember before Tisha B'Av, the 3 weeks, we spoke about the idea of washing oneself during the 9 days. Okay. Once upon a time, washing was an event, it was an iruah, right? It's like, who washes themselves every day? Who washes themselves every week? Oh, that's something crazy. Only certain people can do. Nowadays, if you don't wash every day, then you're the crazy person. So, does the definition of shaveh l'chol nefesh change? Okay, and the vast majority of poskim say, and it's reasonable to assume that yes, it's according to the time, it's according to the generation. And if we assume that nowadays heating up water and washing would be considered shaveh l'chol nefesh, well then the psakim of the Ashkenazim and the Sfardim would actually align in this case, and we may still be able to wash on Yom Tov, even if, and certainly in Eretz Yisrael, many poskim hold this way, when it's a hotter climate, etc., that if the water was heated before Yom Tov, then one would be able to wash. Okay, I still haven't discussed how exactly that translates into our taps and modern plumbing systems, etc., but that is the principle. We'll get there. Okay, now before that, there's another very, very important piece, which is learned here by Rabbi Akiva Eiger. So we spoke about Shvut to Shvut. Okay, so in the source, which you don't have in front of you, but which I have in front of me. So the Rif here, quote, said that this Gzerat HaMechatzaot regarding Shabbat, we were more stringent. He said on Shabbat, on Yom Tov, I'm allowed to wash even if the water was heated up. Right, certainly if the water was heated up before Yom Tov, that would be allowed. Now the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Shin Zayin tells us the following case, and this relates to everything we said before about Shvut to Shvut and asking a non-Jew. He writes the following: Davar she'eino melacha ve'eino asor la'asot b'Shabbat ela mishum Shvut. So something which is not a melacha is only a rabbinic prohibition on Shabbat. Mutar li'Yisrael lomar le'eino Yehudi la'asoto b'Shabbat. I'm allowed to tell a non-Jew to perform it on Shabbat. You're saying, wait a minute, this goes against everything we know. We're not finished. V'hu, under the following conditions. Sheyesha miktzat choli. Either we're dealing with a case of illness, or this, by the way, this is why when it comes to turning on heating and maybe even air conditioning to an extent, but certainly heating and things like that, because we say kol cholin etel sinai. If people are going to be cold, then that's going to lead to illness, and therefore we are more lenient regarding asking non-Jews to perform that. Or there is a case of great need, How do you define what is a great need? Really, really need it, right? That's the I mean, I'm reminded of a story. I don't remember exactly the details, but there was a number of years ago, a certain prominent rabbi in somewhere in Europe, and there was a case where there was a leader of another faith who passed away, and they wanted said rabbi to attend the funeral, which was in a place where he could not attend, and they said to him, Rabbi, you have to understand, we really, really, really want you to come. And the rabbi turned to them and he said, and you have to understand, I really, really, really can't. Right? That was so that's sorry, it's a great need, okay? But whatever it is, we have parameters in halakha, what's considered tzorech harbe, or mipnei mitzvah. Okay, those are the three conditions he brings here. Either it's for illness, it's for a great need, or it's for the sake of a mitzvah. In other places, there are other conditions as well. So he says, Kate said, for example, Omer Yisrael eino Yehudi b'Shabbat la'alot b'ilan la'avi shofar litkoat tkiat mitzvah. If the only shofar that you have is stuck in a tree, well, once upon a time, right? They used to have the shofar up in the trees. You're not allowed to climb a tree. We discussed this previously. You're not allowed to climb a tree on Shabbat or Yom Tov. The only shofar that you have is up in a tree. Climbing the tree is an Isur D'Rabbanan. Okay, you could, for the sake of a mitzvah, you can ask the non-Jew to climb up the tree and to bring you down the shofar. He should not blow the shofar. He should find somebody else who can blow it. But okay.
What if you really, really wanted to?
Or lavi, and now listen to the next case he brings. Or lavi mayim derech chatzer shelo evo lechotz po hamitzta'er. Or to bring water, there's no water, to bring water through a courtyard that does not have an eruv. We'll get later on to the dinim of eruvei chatzerot, but the point is, this is a place where midrabanan, I'm not allowed to carry, so I can ask the non-Jew to carry the water, to bring it to somebody who is uncomfortable, to a mitzta'er, so that they can wash. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger learns from here that the Shulchan Aruch is telling us that you can ask the non-Jew to bring the water for the person to wash, so clearly the person's also allowed to wash. Right? Didn't we just say until now everything that you're not allowed to? So in the other cases, somebody who's mitzta'er, somebody who is really experiencing great discomfort. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger writes, he says, "Mashma de mitzta'er mutar lechotz afilu kufo bechamin sheochmu me'elv Shabbat v'kid yoter mishar shvutim." Okay, he says what you learn from this is, just like the Rif said, quoting the Gaon in terms of Hilchot Yom Tov, that this gzeira of not washing is actually more lenient than other rabbinic decrees that we have. So too, yes, another example, when it comes to a mitzta'er, somebody who is really suffering great discomfort, therefore, sorry? So he says, even washing in hot water. So he says, even washing in warm water that was heated before Shabbat, somebody's mitzvah said that would be allowed. Certainly using cold water that would be permitted. So the Biur Halacha, which is written by the Chavetz Chaim, says, "Ma'im shechum me'erev Shabbat mitzta'er afabi she'eno choli kol aguf yesh lomar mutar lechotz." Right, a mitzta'er is not a choleh. We have a definition of a cholev and a choleh she'ein bo sakana. I mean, somebody who's ill. Mitzta'er is a lower level. It's a very, very hot day. It's 40 degrees outside. Imagine, right? And you don't have air conditioning or whatever, and a person cannot function. That's mitzta'er. Such a situation, one would be allowed to wash.
So this same as istiness for these purposes, the psychological rather than purely physical rules.
I mean, I guess the two are related, but it's probably not the same. It's probably not the same. Here, you probably require a little bit of a greater level of discovery than you would say that. So the default position is that a person not going to wash on Shabbat. A person's going to say, I wash every day. But there's something real. I think it means that there needs to be a real sort of external factor that's causing that discomfort. I think. Okay, now all of that is about hot water. Let's just talk a little bit about cold water, because everything we've seen until now, the Shulchan Aruch even wrote explicitly, you can wash in cold water and there's no problem. This actually is going to relate to the halachot about swimming, right? People often ask. It's always for whatever reason, and this is one of those questions, and all the Kiruv seminars and all the things, one of the things that comes up first is always the question of swimming on Shabbat, and people say, really? Am I really going to go and build a raft if I go and swim on Shabbat? So building a raft is actually one of the reasons that's brought. It's in the Gemara, but there are other reasons. That's right. Very good. So that's on Yom Tov. But that's talking about an open water, enclosed water. That's not an issue. But there are other issues as well that are brought. I mentioned before, I think Rabbi has a tshuva, has quite a number of reasons why one would not be permitted to swim on Shabbat. But it starts off here. So the Shulchan Aruch says, again, going back to Siman Shin Kavav, Harochetz benahar, somebody who goes to swim in the river. Says one has to dry oneself off carefully when they come out of the water. Again, there's a separate issue here. One has to be careful how one dries oneself in terms of one doesn't come to transgress schita. In other words, squeezing water from hair, that is going to be forbidden. But he says, why? Why do you have to dry yourself well? Because if you're going to have the water on you, essentially are carrying the water more than 4 amot. You get out of the right. You get out of the water, and you're full of there's water all over, and you're dripping all over the place. So that is carrying water. Okay. If you're walking in Reshut Rabim and there's a thunderstorm outside, or it's raining and there's lots of water and the water is dripping from you, that we are not makpid about. That we're not concerned.
Sweat and carry water too, like nothing accountable, that's considered carrying water.
Because
you're getting a cleave of water on.
Right, but so say if you have a bag on you, if you have there's all sorts of carrying is not just with your hands, right? But here you intentionally you put yourself into a situation you've now got the extra load, right, that you didn't have before and that you're carrying along with. So he says you should be careful. Now the Shulchan Aruch does not say therefore you cannot go into the water. He just says you have to be careful about this. However, there are a number of Rishonim who preceded the Shulchan Aruch, particularly the Ashkenazi Rishonim, who say that we need to be more stringent than this. So the Trumat Hadeshen, very, very significant of Rishonei Ashkenaz, writes, Mikol Makom, Nireda Idna Bizmanenu. Says nowadays, in our time, the Kule Alma Zehile Shalom Lechotz Klal B'Shabbat. Right now we're going back hundreds of years. Says the Trumat Hadeshen, nowadays everybody knows nobody goes into the water on Shabbat. That is our minhag. Afilu la'akel bein banar bein b'mikveh. We'll see if everybody agrees with that. But he says to go into the water, even to cool off, even if whether it's the river, whether it's the mikveh, whatever it is, we don't go into the water anymore. Even though there is no explicit, you look in the Gemara, you won't find an explicit prohibition against it. In fact, if you look in the Gemara, you'll find it's explicitly permitted in terms of going to the mikveh. And the reason the Gemara gives, the Gemara in Beitza talks about why we cannot toivel kelim on Yom Tov or on Shabbat. And but a person can go into the water. Why? Because a person looks like nir'eh kemekar. You're just going into cool. It looks like you're just going into cool off. So he says, no, we don't do that anymore, and that is forbidden. Nowadays, the custom is to be cautious, and it's more than custom. That is the halakha that we don't go in. Right? Why? So Mishnah Berurah writes here. He says, "Katvu poskim denago shalom chotz klal banal mikveh." He says one does not go. The poskim writes, quoting here the Trumat Hadeshen, that one does not go into the water at all. One reason is because when we said you might come to schita. In other words, there are other. This is like a gzera. There are other concerns that we have. You're going to go into the water. You might come to squeeze water from your hair. You might come to carry the water arba amot, as we said. You may come to transgress other issues. Od kama ta'amim ma'in magen Avraham. Miu yadav raglav mutar lechotz banal shemenagev kodem she'elech arba amot. He says if you just want to go and dip your hands or your feet in, that's okay, and then just make sure you dry them, like the Shulchan Aruch said, before you walk the arba amot. So the Shmirat Shabbat Kilchata, we can bring it even more contemporary terms, writes the following. He says, Noagim shelo lechotz b'Shabbat v'Yom Tov et kol haguf afilu b'mayim karim. He writes a Yom Tov as well. But he says the minhag is that we don't wash the entire body, right, even in cold water. V'rochtzim rak et chelkei haguf she'enam mechusim sa'arot. He says just those parts that are not covered in hair, that is okay. U'mutar lechotz את החלקים האלה במים קרים או אפילו מים פושרים שחוממו מבעוד יום. So he says if it's in cold water or even if it's in lukewarm water, just enough to take off the coldness, that is okay. Remember we saw Rabbi Kenigsberg, somebody who is experiencing discomfort. For example, כגון ביום שלב, מותר אף להתקלח במים כאלה כרגיל בימות החול. He says, in such a case, then you can go and you can wash, you can even have a shower in cold water or not, or right, lukewarm water. But one has to be careful not to wring out the hair, etc. Rav Moshe Feinstein also, right, similarly, he says, he's asked the question, the custom is we don't wash on Shabbat, even in cold water. Even if one is experiencing discomfort, because it's very, very hot, can one not do this? So he says, like the Tzurba wrote, he says that you have to be stringent. If there's no discomfort, if there's no reason for it, you have to be stringent. Again, we're talking on Shabbat. Even though we haven't found explicitly in Isur relating to this, but that's the practice. In practice, we are stringent. But if there is a tza'ar, so then one can be more lenient. Okay, the Sephardi psak over here is a little bit more lenient than the Ashkenazim, as we saw, right? This extra stringency of washing in cold water that was brought by the Trumat Hadeshin, it was an Ashkenazi Rishon. So the Yalkut Yosef writes, "Mutar להתקלח בשבת במים צוננים אפילו כל גופו, ובלבד שיזהר שלא יבוא לידי סחיטת השיער והמגבת." The Yalkut Yosef says on Shabbat you can have a shower in cold water, that's fine. Just be careful when you're drying yourself. לפיכך נכון שימתין מעט קודם שנגב ומגבת, שינטפו המים מעליו. Therefore, you should wait a bit for the water to drip off before you dry yourself, and then you should dry not to v'nagef b'nachat, dry gently. V'chein lo yischot hamayim shebasar rosh v'zakan. Don't forget, don't squeeze the water out of your hair and your beard. Ve'ashkenazim noagim shelo l'tarchet b'shabbat af mayim tzonim shebana'alot. But the Ashkenazim would not wash in cold water in the rivers, even, right? Part of that is that also in the bath of the shower, even in cold water, we would refrain. If it's very, very hot, you're sweating excessively, then then you could take a shower in cold water. And only you should be careful not to wring out the hair and the towel. Okay, immersing, does this apply to a mikveh as well? That's all a separate topic. We'll talk about that in a different shiur. I just want to say regarding Yom Tov, but as we've seen, so all these sources that say that one has to be stringent for the Sfadim are okay. The Sfadim, we said it can be lenient, but these sources say that you need to be stringent even in cold water, and even on Shabbat, and even on Yom Tov. So even if we could get around the question of Shaveh L'Kol Nefesh, etc., would it be a problem for Ashkenazim to take a shower on Yom Tov? So there are many poskim who say that this practice, again, we note that what the Trumat Hadeshin here is talking about is not, he says, and everybody said, there is no explicit prohibition that we found, only there's a practice to be stringent. What was the reason for? So the Mishnah Berurah wrote that we're worried about schita, but he also wrote we're worried about that you might come to carry. Why is it specifically in the rivers? Because you might come to Arba Amot. So when we get to Yom Tov, which is not Shabbat, where there is no prohibition of carrying either, so it's possible that we can be lenient in this regard as well, and that is a petach for. Sorry? Right. So the problem with that is that we have seen that that's what the Yalkut Yosef writes as well. He says that Ashkenazim, this practice of not washing in the rivers, etc., that applies to indoor baths and showers as well. But we saw in the same way we can be lenient in the place of tza'ar. So there is room to be lenient on Yom Tov as well. Not all the rationale applies, and it may be that nowadays the custom is slightly different. There are still those who are stringent on Yom Tov not to shower at all, but certainly when it's 2 days, or when it's even sometimes when it gets to 3 days, and it gets very, 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 very hot. So there are, so long as one takes the necessary precautions, there are grounds to be lenient as well. I still haven't discussed exactly how this applies regarding the shemesh and the boiler, etc. That we have is the water when we open up the tap. Is that considered water that was heated on Yom Tov or before Yom Tov, etc.? It's a little bit complicated, but we don't have time to go into it now. But that is the bottom line is that there are those who are stringent, but there are many others who find room to be lenient as well, if there is a need. Okay, so we'll stop there. As I mentioned, next week there will be a shiur. I'm not sure yet if we'll continue next week on Hilchot Shabbat or we'll move on to Rosh Hashanah or either the week after. But over the course of the next few weeks, we'll be discussing Hilchot Elul, Rosh Hashanah, Aseret Yemei Teshuvah as well. I'd count.
Don't have two.
What's that?
3 weeks is there